Brandon Keller grabbed the microphone pointed straight at Caleb Whitmore and laughed into a room of 300 people. "Ladies and gentlemen, here's the man who peaked in shop class." The ballroom erupted. Caleb didn't flinch, didn't move, just stood there holding a glass of water while the laughter washed over him like something he'd felt 1,000 times before. But 30 minutes later, every single person who laughed would go completely silent. Because someone was about to walk through those doors. Someone worth $3 billion, and she wasn't coming for Brandon Keller. She was coming for him. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, subscribe. Every single story on this channel is built for men who've been counted out. Let's begin. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. A plain white envelope slid through the mail slot and landed face down on Caleb Whitmore's kitchen floor, where it sat for 3 days before he noticed it. He noticed it because his daughter Emma stepped over it every morning on her way to the refrigerator, and on the 4th day, she finally picked it up, turned it over and said, "Dad, this is from your high school." He was at the counter making coffee. He didn't turn around. "Throw it away." "It says 20th reunion. I heard what you said." "Dad." He turned around then, not because he'd changed his mind, but because Emma had a way of saying his name that made him feel like the teenager in the room, not her. She was 17, and she had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, which meant that combination was nearly impossible to argue with. She held the envelope out with both hands like it was something ceremonial. "You haven't been anywhere in 2 years, not one single place that wasn't work or a grocery store or my school." "I go other places." "Name one." He opened his mouth. He closed it. "Dad, go." He took the envelope. He told himself he wouldn't go. He went. The drive into the city took 45 minutes, and Caleb spent most of it arguing with himself in the quiet of a car that still had a child's soccer cleat in the back seat, and an air freshener shaped like a pine tree that had stopped smelling like anything 2 years ago. He had on the navy blazer he'd bought for a job interview in 2019. It still fit, not because he'd stayed the same size, but because the years had thinned him out just enough to match what he'd been when he was younger and thinner, and believed that blazers mattered. He'd polished his shoes that afternoon. They were old shoes. Good polish couldn't change what they were. He had debated wearing a tie. He decided against it. A tie would feel like he was trying. He didn't want anyone to think he was trying. That thought alone told him more about himself than he wanted to know. The hotel was enormous. Glass and steel, and lit up from the inside, like something you'd see on a magazine cover, which made a kind of sense, because the people inside were exactly the kind of people who ended up on magazine covers. He sat in his car in the parking garage for 6 minutes after he killed the engine. He watched other cars pull in BMWs, a Range Rover, a blacked-out Tesla that cost more than his annual salary. Men in suits that fit. Women in dresses that cost more than his rent. He almost started the car again. He thought about Emma saying his name. He got out. The ballroom was already full by the time Caleb walked in, and the first thing that hit him was the noise, not loud exactly, but layered. The kind of noise that happens when everyone in a room is simultaneously performing. Laughter timed slightly too well. Voices pitched slightly too high. Everyone slightly more interesting than they actually were. He got a glass of water from the bar, not alcohol, because he had a 45-minute drive home, and because he had learned over the years that clarity was something worth protecting, and he found a spot near the back wall where he could exist without being directly in anyone's eye line. That was the goal. Exist. Survive. Go home. Tell Emma it was fine. He'd managed maybe 8 minutes of successful invisibility before Brandon Keller found him. Brandon Keller had been in high school, the kind of person who filled a room the moment he entered it. Not because he was particularly intelligent or particularly kind, but because he had volume and confidence and a face that people found automatically trustworthy before he'd done anything to earn that trust. 20 years had been generous to Brandon in the superficial ways and unkind to him in the ways that took longer to show. He was heavier. His hairline had shifted back. But he was wearing a suit that probably cost $4,000 and a watch that definitely cost more than that, and he wore them the way men wear things when they need everyone to know exactly what those things cost. He saw Caleb from across the room. Caleb watched him come over and thought, here we go. Caleb Whitmore. Brandon spread his arms like he was greeting an old friend, which he was not. Man, I almost didn't recognize you. Brandon. They shook hands. Brandon's grip was the kind that was trying to communicate something. What are you doing hiding over here? Come out and talk to people, man. Half these guys would love to catch up. I'm good here. Come on. Brandon looked him over a quick scan top to bottom, the way you appraise something you're considering buying. You look exactly the same, you know that. Exactly. Like time just... He made a gesture, something vague. Passed you by. It was phrased like a compliment. It was not a compliment. Caleb said nothing. He'd learned long ago that some conversational doors were better left closed. So what are you doing now? Still in engineering. Consulting. Technical consulting. Yeah, what kind of company? I work with a few different clients. Infrastructure mostly. Some energy work. Right. Brandon was already losing interest. Caleb could see it in the slight glaze that came over his eyes when there was no impressive noun attached to the answer. No company name. No title. No number. So like freelance. Something like that. Huh. Another glance at the blazer. The shoes. Well, hey, there's no shame in that. Some guys, you know. He paused as though searching for the charitable version of what he was about to say. Some guys just find their level and stay there. Not everyone needs to. He waved his hand toward the room, toward the suits and the watches and the conversations being had in louder voices than necessary. You know. I know. You married kids. Daughter, 17. Divorced. A beat. Yes. Ah. Brandon nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're confirming a suspicion. Yeah, I heard something about that. Tough break, man. Tough break. He clapped Caleb on the shoulder once-twice the way you pat something you've dismissed. Well, hey. Drink something stronger than water, all right? Live a little. He walked away. Caleb looked down at his glass. Live a little. I thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when Emma had called him from school because she'd sprained her wrist in gym and needed him to come. He thought about leaving a client call mid-sentence, driving 20 minutes in the wrong direction, sitting with her in the nurse's office while she pretended she wasn't crying. He thought about the way she let him hold her hand for exactly 45 seconds before she composed herself and said, "Okay, I'm fine, you can go back to work now." I thought about the fact that he'd been at every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every Saturday morning soccer game for 11 years. Solo. Carrying a folding chair and a travel mug of coffee and a sign. Emma made him stop holding up after she turned 13. He thought about the engineering position in Austin he'd turned down in 2018 because taking it would have meant uprooting her life, and she'd already survived enough upheaval. I thought about the project in Seattle in 2021. The renewable infrastructure contract that would have put his name on something permanent and visible that he'd walked away from because Emma's junior year was not the year to have an absentee father. Live a little. He almost smiled. The slideshow started around 8:30. Someone had apparently assembled a tribute reel of all the most successful members of the graduating class of 2004, a phrase that implied there was a measurable thing called success that could be verified, ranked, and projected onto a 10-foot screen in a hotel ballroom. Caleb watched from the back. There was a cardiologist from Dallas who'd written a book. There was a woman who'd started a cosmetics company that had been acquired for $60 million. There was a former classmate turned state senator who looked exactly like the kind of person you'd expect to become a state senator. There was Brandon Keller with a slide dedicated entirely to the real estate portfolio that apparently included 14 properties across 3 states, with a photograph of him standing in front of a house large enough to qualify as a small institution. The room applauded for each one. The applause was genuine. That was the honest thing. The people in this room were genuinely impressed by the things on that screen, because they'd been taught since approximately the 3rd grade that those were the things worth being impressed by. Caleb did not begrudge them this. He was watching the screen when his own slide appeared. He hadn't been expecting it. He'd submitted a brief bio when he registered. The form had asked for professional title and current employer, and he'd written what was true, which wasn't much. The slide read, Caleb Whitmore, engineering consultant, father. That was it. No company name, no awards listed, no photograph of a house or a portfolio or a book cover. Just two lines that, in the context of everything that had preceded them, felt like a whisper in a room full of people shouting. The applause that followed was the polite kind. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Scattered, distributed unevenly, the kind that happens when a room isn't sure whether it's appropriate to be quiet. Caleb kept his eyes straight ahead. To his right, he heard a woman. Someone he didn't know well. Someone who'd been in his AP chemistry class lean toward her husband and say something just barely above a whisper. He didn't catch all of it. He caught enough. Feels bad. Wonder what happened to him. He looked down at the floor. The carpet was a dark burgundy with a gold geometric pattern, and he studied it for a moment because it was better than looking at the screen where his two-line life was still being projected for 240 people to evaluate. He was not ashamed. That was important. He was not ashamed, and he was not angry, and he was not the version of himself that he'd been at 22, when the opinion of a room full of people had still felt like something that could determine the shape of his life. But he was tired. He was tired in the specific way that happens when you've spent years being underestimated by people who have never once tried to understand the terms on which you're living your life. He was tired of explaining. He was tired of the math that other people did on his behalf, the calculation where they tallied up his job title and his divorce and his quiet apartment and his old blazer and arrived at a number that they felt summed him up accurately. He was tired of being summed up. He found a quiet corner near the bar and ordered a club soda with lime because the lime made it feel slightly more like he was participating in something social. And he stood there alone in the specific way that a man can be alone in a full room, completely surrounded and entirely by himself. A former classmate named Derek Osei stopped by, one of the few people Caleb had genuinely liked in high school. Derek was a high school football coach now in Columbus, Ohio. He had a warm handshake and a laugh that came from somewhere real, and the two of them talked for 20 minutes about Derek's team and Caleb's daughter, and the general peculiarity of finding yourself 40 years old in a room full of people you used to be 18 with. "You doing okay, man?" Derek asked at one point, and it was the kind of question that contained an actual question inside it. "Yeah, I'm good." "You look tired." "I am tired, but it's a different kind than what you're thinking." Derek studied him for a moment. "Emma good." "She's great. She wants to study environmental engineering." Derek laughed. "Of course she does. She's going to be better at it than I ever was." That might be the most dad thing anyone has ever said. Caleb smiled, a real one, for the first time that evening. "I know." They talked until Derek's wife appeared and pulled him toward someone they hadn't seen in 15 years. And then Caleb was alone again, which was fine. He had his club soda and his corner and his thoughts, and he had long ago made peace with the fact that solitude was not the same thing as loneliness, even when it looked the same from the outside. He was checking his watch, almost 9:30, which meant another 40 minutes before he could reasonably leave without it feeling like retreat. When the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and everything changed. It started with the security. Not hotel security, different. Private. 2 men in dark suits who entered the ballroom first and positioned themselves with the casual efficiency of people who'd done this 10,000 times in 10,000 rooms. Then cameras. Not event photographers, media. Actual camera operators and a woman with a microphone who scanned the room like she was already assembling the shot in her head. And then the conversation stopped, not all at once. Like a wave from the door moving inward, the sound in the room dropped as people turned and recognized, and then went quiet in the involuntary way that happens when a certain kind of person enters a space. Caleb didn't see her at first because he was too far back and too short to see over the general mass of people suddenly shifting and craning their necks. But he heard the name. 2 people near him said it simultaneously. Victoria Sterling. He knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Victoria Sterling was 37 years old and worth somewhere between $2 and $3 billion, depending on which quarter you checked. And her company Sterling Tech had essentially rewritten how mid-sized American cities manage their energy infrastructure. She'd been on the cover of Forbes twice once, and approximately 47 other publications he couldn't remember. She'd spoken at Davos. She'd testified before Congress. She'd declined a presidential appointment to stay focused on her company, which was either very principled or very good PR depending on your level of cynicism. She was not a person who showed up at 20-year high school reunions. She especially was not a person who showed up at this 20-year high school reunion because Caleb realized working it out. She would have graduated in 2005, which meant she wasn't even in their class. He pushed up slightly on his toes. He could see her now past the crowd, a small woman with dark hair and the kind of posture that came from years of walking into rooms full of people who underestimated her and deciding that was their problem. He watched Brandon, near the center of the room, smooth his jacket and begin to move toward her. He watched 3 other men do the same thing. He watched the current of the room reorganize itself around her, the way water reorganizes around a stone. Victoria Sterling smiled at each person who approached. She was gracious. She was present. She shook hands and said something brief and moved forward. Moved forward. Not toward the center of the room where the crowd was thickest. Not toward the bar or the food or the slideshow. Forward and slightly to the left in a way that seemed from Caleb's vantage point, from his corner, from his outside position in this room full of people who'd never considered him an inside person. Purposeful. She was looking for someone. He watched her eyes move across the room. It was subtle, she was too practiced to make it obvious, but he could see it. The scan, the search. Her smile never dropped, but her eyes were doing a different thing than her mouth was doing. Someone nearby said, "Who's she looking for?" Another voice said, "Probably Keller. They're both in real estate adjacent." A third voice said, "She doesn't do real estate." Caleb lowered back down onto his heels and looked at his watch again. He was calculating how many minutes until he could leave without. When he looked up, she was looking at him. Not at the general direction of his corner. At him. He did what anyone would do in that situation. He looked behind himself. There was a wall. He turned back. She was still looking at him, and she was walking toward him. The crowd parted for her without being asked. That was the thing about certain kinds of people. The room just organized itself around them because it had been trained to, and everyone in her path stepped aside with a kind of automatic deference, which meant Caleb had an unobstructed view of her coming toward him from 30 feet away, then 20, then 10. He didn't move. He genuinely didn't know what to do with the information his eyes were sending him. So he stood completely still. The way you do when you're not sure if the thing you're seeing is actually happening. She stopped in front of him. She was shorter than she looked in photographs. She had dark eyes and a kind of stillness about her that wasn't coldness, it was precision. Like someone who had learned that most of what people said with their bodies was unnecessary and had edited themselves down to only what mattered. She looked at him for a long moment. The noise in the room had dropped significantly. People were watching. Some of them had their phones out. She said nothing for 2, 3, 4 seconds. Then she said, "You're harder to find than you should be." Caleb stared at her. "I'm sorry." Caleb Whitmore, engineering consultant. The ghost of a smile. Father. He recognized the words from the slideshow. He felt his chest do something complicated. "Do I?" he started. "Have we met?" She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Something between gravity and relief. Something that had been traveling a long distance and had finally arrived. "No," she said. "We haven't. But I've been looking for you for a very long time." Behind him, he heard Brandon Keller say something to the man next to him. He heard the confusion in it. The bafflement. The beginning of the recalculation. But Caleb wasn't looking at Brandon. He was looking at a woman he had never met, who was looking at him like he was something she'd been searching for, without a map across 20 years of a life he'd spent in total obscurity. And he was thinking, "I don't understand what's happening. And also, whatever it is, it's about to change everything." Can we go somewhere quieter? She asked. Yes, sure. There's a sitting room off the east corridor. My team checked it earlier. Her team checked it earlier. He followed her through the crowd, which was an experience unlike any he'd had in recent memory. People who had spent the entire evening talking past him suddenly tracked him with their eyes. He felt the shift in the room's attention, the way you feel. Weather changing, something in the air, pressure, something that hadn't been there before. Brandon Keller stepped forward slightly as they passed, and Caleb saw him open his mouth. Victoria Sterling glanced at him for half a second. The way you glance at a piece of furniture you've decided to walk around, and she kept walking. Brandon closed his mouth. Caleb kept his face neutral. The sitting room was a small space off the main corridor hotel furniture. A low table, a window overlooking a courtyard. A man in a dark suit was positioned outside the door, which closed behind them with a sound like the room had made a decision. Victoria sat across from him. She placed her hands flat on the table in front of her. It was a gesture he'd seen people make when they were about to say something they'd been rehearsing. I know this is strange, she said. I know you have no idea who I am beyond. She gestured vaguely the way people gesture at the general fact of their public life. Beyond what everyone knows. Victoria Sterling, he said. Sterling Tech. You were at Davos in January. Before that, the Senate Subcommittee on Infrastructure. Your company's Q3 numbers were... She blinked. You follow my company. I'm in energy infrastructure consulting. I follow most of the major players. He paused. I didn't know you went to Millfield. I didn't. Not for senior year. I transferred. A brief something crossed her face. I left after junior year. I came back just for this. For the reunion. For you. He sat back. Not dramatically, just the small involuntary movement of a person absorbing information that doesn't match the shape of the world as they understand it. Ms. Sterling. Victoria. Victoria. He said it carefully. I don't know what you think. I'm not sure what connection you believe we have, but I think you may have me confused with someone. Caleb Thomas Whitmore, she said. Your grandfather's name was Harold. He was a machinist in Youngstown, Ohio. He gave you a pocket watch when you were 14, a 1941 Elgin Railroad watch. He told you it was the most valuable thing he owned. The room was very quiet. Caleb did not say anything. That watch disappeared from your apartment in the fall of 2003. Victoria continued. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was not steady at all. Something that had been held in a long time. You reported it missing. Your roommate at the time told the housing office you'd sold it. You told him it was stolen. He knew you were lying, but he didn't understand why. Caleb looked at his hands. A week after that watch disappeared, she said. I received a letter from the University Financial Aid Office. An anonymous scholarship. Enough to cover my remaining tuition and housing. Full year. Renewable. She paused. I didn't know who sent it. I spent... She stopped. Pressed her lips together. Restarted. I spent a long time trying to find out. The Financial Aid Office said the donor had specifically requested anonymity. I hired a private investigator in 2011. He found a dead end. I found an estate attorney in 2017 who'd processed the original sale of the watch, but he wouldn't release client information. She paused again. His name was Harold Whitmore, same name as your grandfather. Caleb said nothing for a very long time. Outside the window, the courtyard was lit with the kind of tasteful landscape lighting that hotels use to make ordinary spaces look significant. The attorney passed away last March, Victoria said. His daughter found letters in his files. He'd kept records, everything, the buyer, the transaction, the instructions for where the money should go. She looked at him directly. He left her a note asking her to make sure the right person eventually knew the truth. Another silence. So she told you, Caleb said. She sent me everything. He nodded slowly. He was looking at the table now, at the grain in the wood, at something he could look at that wasn't her face, and the thing her face was doing. I was 22, he said. I wasn't... He stopped, started again. It wasn't a heroic thing. I want you to understand that. I was standing in the hallway outside that classroom, and I could see you through the door, and I could see what you were holding. The letter. And he exhaled. I knew what that letter was, because I'd almost had one like it the year before my financial aid came through, and I couldn't walk away. You sold your grandfather's watch. It was a watch. Your grandfather gave it to you. He gave it to me because he thought I'd use it wisely. He finally looked up at her. His voice was very quiet. He was right. Victoria Sterling, who had negotiated with senators and CEOs and heads of state, who had sat across tables from people trying to dismantle everything she'd built and had held her ground, who had not cried in a business meeting in 11 years. Her eyes filled. She didn't look away. She didn't try to hide it. I don't know how to tell you, she said, what that scholarship meant. I was done. I had already decided. I was going to withdraw, go back to Cincinnati, get a job at my aunt's restaurant. I had a plan, a real one. And then that letter came and She stopped, breathed. I called my mother and I couldn't even explain it to her. I just cried on the phone for 20 minutes. And then I went back to class. I know, Caleb said quietly. You know, I saw you go back, the next morning. I was coming out of the engineering building and you were crossing the quad and you were walking differently than you'd been walking before. He paused. I knew the scholarship had come through. You watched. I wanted to make sure it worked. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, something at the intersection of the two. You never told anyone. There was no reason to. You let me spend 20 years not knowing. It wasn't about me knowing that you knew. That's not why I did it. Then why? He was quiet for a moment. Because you deserve to finish what you started, he said. And I could make that happen. That was enough. That was the whole thing. She looked at him for a long moment. It wasn't enough for me, she said. What you did, the life I've been able to build, the people my company has employed, the communities we've changed, none of that happens without you. None of it. And I've been carrying that without being able to say thank you to the right person for 20 years, and I need you to understand that that is not a small thing to carry. Caleb didn't know what to say to that. He'd spent 20 years being a person nobody particularly noticed, a person who fixed things and solved problems and showed up and did the work. And he had made a kind of private peace with invisibility, because he'd had to, because there was a child to raise and a life to build, and no bandwidth for self-pity. And now a woman was sitting across from him, telling him that his invisible decision had grown into something enormous while he wasn't watching. It was a strange thing to sit with, a heavy thing, a beautiful thing. You're welcome, he said finally, for whatever that's worth now. It's worth more than you know, she said. But I didn't just come here to say thank you. He waited. I came here, Victoria Sterling said, because I want to offer you something, and I want you to hear all of it before you say anything. Outside in the corridor, the muffled sound of the reunion continued. 300 people who had spent the evening measuring each other, and in a quiet room off the east corridor, a man nobody had thought to measure was about to find out exactly what he was worth. He sat forward. I'm listening, he said. The word listening sat in the air between them like a door held open. Victoria didn't rush it. She was a person who understood the weight of pauses, who had learned somewhere in the years between that university hallway and the Senate chamber that the moment before a thing is said can determine everything about how it lands. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and placed a single folded document on the table between them. She didn't push it toward him yet. 3 years ago, she began. I started planning the largest project my company has ever attempted. Not an acquisition, not a tech rollout, a physical thing, a real thing. A facility innovation center research hub community development platform, built from the ground up in a mid-sized American city that has been losing population and infrastructure funding for 20 years. She paused. The kind of city where a machinist like your grandfather used to work. The kind of city that used to make things and slowly stopped being able to afford to. Caleb was very still. The facility is going to focus on sustainable energy infrastructure, how to build it, how to maintain it, how to train the local workforce to run it, rather than importing contractors from outside. How to make communities energy independent in a way that actually lasts longer than the political cycle that funded it. She looked at him steadily. I've been working on the design framework for 18 months. I've talked to architects and urban planners and city officials and economists, and there's a problem. What kind of problem? The problem is that everyone I've brought into the room can tell me what it should look like and what it should cost and how to get it permitted. But none of them can tell me how it should actually work, how the engineering integrates with the community, how you design something that real people with real jobs and real lives can actually use and trust and maintain without a PhD. She paused. How you build something that works behind the scenes, quietly, reliably, without anyone needing to know your name. He recognized the phrase. He recognized it because it was the shape of his entire career. You need a systems engineer, he said. I need the right one. There are better engineers than me, with more visible resumes and more... I've read your work, he stopped. Not the work you've been credited for, she said. The work that's in the infrastructure, the solved problems, the systems running in 4 cities right now that nobody knows you designed because the companies you consulted for took the contracts and the credit. She watched his face. You know which ones I mean. He did know. The water reclamation system in Pittsburgh, the grid redundancy architecture in Louisville, the heat distribution network in a suburb of Cleveland that had been failing for 6 years before a company hired him to fix it and then listed a different engineer's name on the final report. He'd been paid. He hadn't argued. He'd moved on. He'd always moved on. How did you find that? He asked. I have good researchers. And when I tell them to find the person who actually designed something rather than the person who got credit for it, they know what to look for. A pause. It took 8 months. You're very good at not being found. I'm good at doing the work and leaving. I know. That's exactly what I don't want you to do this time. He looked at the folded document on the table. He hadn't touched it. What's the offer? Lead the design team. The whole engineering framework from site to system. 2-year initial commitment. Full creative authority over the technical architecture. Competitive salary, obviously, but that's not the important part. She finally slid this document toward him. The important part is that your name goes on it, publicly, permanently, on the building, on the research, on the record. The work you do will be yours in every way that matters. He looked at the document but didn't pick it up. I have a daughter who's finishing high school, he said. I know, Emma. She wants to study environmental engineering. The corner of her mouth moved. Good researchers. Something in him shifted at that, the fact of being known, the strange and slightly unsettling warmth of it. She applies to college in the spring, he said. The facility is based in Columbus, Ohio, 2.5 hours from here. The role can be structured to allow you to stay local during her senior year. My team has already mapped out what that would look like. You planned for that. I planned for everything I could anticipate. She's your daughter. Of course I planned for that. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the particular look of a man running calculations that have nothing to do with engineering. Victoria, he said carefully, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. Always. Is this? He searched for the right words. Is this about the debt? Is this about you feeling like you owe me something? And this is the repayment. And once the 2 years are done and the building is built, we're square and everyone can move on. She didn't answer immediately, which he respected. Partly, she finally said. I won't lie to you. Partly it is. Because I do owe you. Because without you there is no Sterling Tech, and I am aware of that every day. She leaned forward slightly. But that's not why you're the right person for this job. You're the right person because I have spent months trying to find someone who can build what I need, and everyone I've talked to is good at the parts they understand and indifferent to the parts they don't. And you? She gestured at him, at the general fact of him, the blazer and the old shoes and the quiet and the years. You've spent your whole life caring about the parts that nobody else bothered to understand. He looked at her for a long moment. I need to think about it. I know. I need to talk to Emma. Of course. And I'm not saying yes tonight. I want you to understand that. Tonight I am not saying yes. I don't need yes tonight. She sat back. I need you to take the document and read it. Really read it. The engineering specs, the community framework, the timeline. Read it the way you'd read something you were actually going to build. A pause. And then call me. He picked up the document. It was heavier than he'd expected. Not physically. Physically, it was a folded set of papers, maybe 20 pages. But the weight of it was something else. The weight of being seen. Of 20 years of work finally being pointed at with intention. Of a door opening in a wall he'd long ago assumed was solid. He folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his blazer. Thank you, he said, for coming here, for all of it. Don't thank me. I'm the one who spent 20 years not knowing your name. She stood. He stood. She extended her hand. I'll hear from you. You'll hear from me. They shook hands, not the kind of handshake Brandon Keller had offered earlier, the kind that was trying to establish something about hierarchy. This was the other kind. The kind between two people who had just arrived at an honest place. She moved toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. For what it's worth, she said without turning around. What you did selling that watch. Doing it anonymously. Not once reaching out in 20 years. A pause. That's the rarest thing I've ever encountered in a human being. And I've encountered a lot of human beings. She left. He stood in the quiet sitting room for 3 full minutes. Then he went back to the ballroom. The first thing he noticed when he walked back in was the silence. Not literal silence. The room still had its noise, its conversation, its undercurrent of performance. But the specific frequency of attention had changed. He could feel it the way you feel a room where everyone has just finished talking about you. People looked at him differently. It was subtle and it was unmistakable. Brandon Keller was standing near the center of the room with a drink in his hand and an expression that Caleb couldn't quite categorize. Something between confusion and recalibration, like a man who has just been handed a spreadsheet that doesn't add up in the way he expected. Derek Osei appeared at Caleb's elbow almost immediately. Okay, Derek said quietly. I need you to explain what just happened. What do you mean? Victoria Sterling. The Victoria Sterling walked into this reunion, ignored every single person in the room, walked directly to you, and then the two of you disappeared for 20 minutes. Derek looked at him with the expression of a man who has been patient enough. That's what I mean. We talked. About what? Old times. Derek stared at him. Caleb, you didn't go to school with her? No. So what old times? Caleb considered this. He considered the document in his jacket pocket, the weight of it, the 20 years of weight behind it. He considered what it meant to have carried something privately for so long that privacy had become structural, a part of how he was built. We have a connection, he said. From a long time ago. I'll explain it someday. Someday. Yeah. Derek looked at him for a moment, then slowly nodded. Okay. All right. That's the most infuriatingly vague thing you've ever said, and I've known you since we were 16. I know. You're not going to give me anything. Not tonight. Derek shook his head, but he was smiling. You haven't changed at all, man. Not at all. Caleb thought, that's not entirely true. Something had changed in the last 20 minutes. He couldn't name it precisely, but something that had been sealed had cracked slightly, and light was coming through a gap that hadn't been there before he walked into that sitting room. He thought about Emma. He took out his phone and typed, "You awake?" 3 dots appeared immediately. Obviously. Did something happen? You never text at events. Something happened. Tell you when I get home. Dad. You can't just say that. Go to sleep. Absolutely not. He smiled at his phone in the middle of a ballroom full of people who were still trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. The drive home took 45 minutes, and this time he didn't argue with himself. He thought instead. He thought about the document in his jacket pocket. He thought about what Victoria had said, your name goes on it publicly permanently, and the way those words had landed in him, not like ambition, but like something correcting itself. Like a door that had been slightly off its hinge for years, finally being reset. I thought about the engineering. Because under everything else, under the surprise and the weight of being found, and the strange emotional complexity of the evening, what had genuinely pulled at him was the description of the problem. The gap between what the planners could design and what the community could actually use. The difference between a system that was theoretically correct and one that actually worked in the hands of real people living real lives. That was exactly the problem he was best at solving. He'd known it for 20 years. He'd been solving it in the dark for 20 years. He pulled into his driveway at 11:43, and the porch light was on, which meant Emma had turned it on for him, because she always turned on the porch light when he came home late, and she had been doing this since she was 12 years old, without ever being asked, without ever making a thing of it. That single fact made the back of his throat tighten in a way that nothing else about the evening had. He turned the car off and sat for a moment. Harold. He thought about his grandfather. About a railroad watch made in 1941 by people in Illinois who'd built it to last. About giving something away and watching it turn into something you could never have predicted. About what his grandfather had told him when he gave him the watch. This keeps time, Caleb. But time isn't what makes a man. What makes a man is what he does with it. He got out of the car. Emma was sitting on the couch in pajamas with a cup of tea, which she'd started drinking at 16 because she said it made her feel like a person who had everything under control, and Caleb had never been able to argue with that logic. She looked at him when he came through the door. "You look different," she said immediately. "I've been gone 4 hours." "You look different than you looked 4 hours ago." She set down her tea. "Sit down, tell me." He sat down. He told her. Not everything, not the whole of it, not all the layers, but the shape of it. He told her about the slideshow and the 2 lines. He told her about Victoria Sterling walking in. He told her about the sitting room and what had been said in it. He took the document out of his jacket pocket and set it on the coffee table between them. Emma looked at the document. She looked at him. She didn't say anything for a moment, which was unusual because Emma almost always had something to say. "She knew about me," Emma said. "Yes. She planned for me, for my senior year. She tried to." Emma picked up the document. She turned it over in her hands without opening it. She was doing the same calculation he'd been doing in the car, and he could see it on her face. Not the simple version, not the obvious version, but the real one. The one that accounted for both of them. "Dad," she finally said. "This watch. Grandpa Harold's watch." She looked at him carefully. "You never told me what happened to it. You said it was stolen." He met her eyes. "I know. You sold it, for a stranger." She was a person who needed something, and I had something that could help. Emma set the document down. She leaned back against the couch cushions and looked at him with an expression he'd seen on her face maybe a dozen times in her life. The expression she got when she was encountering something too large and too real for the ordinary emotional vocabulary of a 17-year-old, and she was having to build new language for it in real time. "You never told me," she said. "There was nothing to tell." "Dad, there is a tremendous amount to tell. At the time there wasn't. At the time it was just a decision I made. You gave away your grandfather's watch. I gave away a possession. The stories about it, the meaning of it that comes with me wherever I go." He tapped his chest once lightly. "Harold's in here. That watch was just metal." Emma stared at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the document and opened it. She read in silence for 10 minutes. He watched her face move through the engineering specs, the community framework, the timeline. He watched her pause on a particular page. He guessed it was the section about the environmental technology integration, the part that would make her brain catch fire in the specific way that his had when he'd first heard Victoria describe it. "This is real," Emma said. "This isn't a favor. This is a real thing that needs you specifically." "That's my read. And Columbus is 2.5 hours away." "Yes. So you could stay here for senior year. Come down on weekdays, back on weekends, or..." Or we find something else. There are options. She nodded slowly, still reading. Environmental infrastructure. Community integration. Local workforce development. She turned a page. Dad, this is what you've been doing for 20 years, but with someone actually acknowledging that you're doing it. He said nothing. That's the thing, isn't it? It wasn't a question. It's not just the project. It's you've been building things that work and leaving and letting other people put their names on it. And she's offering you. The name isn't the point. Then what is? He thought about it honestly. The chance to build something that stays, he said. Something I can point at. Something that, he stopped, tried again. When you're my age or older, I want there to be something in the world that would not have existed if I hadn't been here. Not credit, not applause. Just a thing that works, that helps people, that I can know about. Emma was quiet for a moment. Like a scholarship, she said. He looked at her. Her face was entirely calm. Not accusatory, not sentimental, just arriving at the truth with the clean efficiency of someone who had in fact been raised by an engineer. Like a scholarship, he agreed. She nodded slowly. She looked back at the document. Then she set it down and picked up her tea and looked at him over the rim of the mug. You're going to call her, Emma said. I said I needed to think about it. You're going to call her, he almost argued. The argument dissolved before it formed. Yeah, he said. I'm going to call her. Emma nodded as though this were the only reasonable outcome, and she'd simply been waiting for him to arrive there. She held her tea mug with both hands. The way she'd been doing since she was 8 years old, when he'd made her hot chocolate on the Saturday mornings, when it was just the two of them, and the whole quiet weekend lay ahead. She was almost grown. She was almost out the door. I was going to have to learn to build a life that wasn't built entirely around her, and he had known this was coming, and he had not entirely prepared for it, and now something was landing in his lap that might be the shape of that life. He would have wanted this, Emma said. Your great-grandfather. He'd have said finally, in that voice he used. Caleb smiled. Yeah, he would have. Go to bed, Dad. You look exhausted. I am exhausted. Call her in the morning, not too early. She probably gets up at 4 in the morning. Call her whenever. He stood. He picked up the document from the coffee table and held it for a moment. Emma. Yeah. Thank you. She tilted her head. For what? For turning on the porch light. She looked at him with the expression that meant she understood he was saying something larger than the words. Always, she said. He called Victoria Sterling at 7:48 the next morning. She answered on the second ring. I read the document, he said. And? The heat distribution modeling in Section 4 is wrong. A pause. Wrong how? The coefficient calculation doesn't account for the soil composition in that part of Ohio. You'll lose 30% efficiency in winter months unless you redesign the underground routing. A pause. I can fix it. A longer pause. You read a 20-page engineering document overnight and found a modeling error. I was awake anyway. Caleb, I'll take the job. The silence on the other end of the line was brief, one beat two, and then she said, good. Just that. One word. But in it was something that had been traveling 20 years and had finally reached its destination. I have conditions, he said. Name them. Emma finishes senior year before I relocate anything. I stay local through June. Done. My name on the engineering reports, all of them, from the first one. Already written into the contract. And I want autonomy on the design decisions. I'll report to you on outcomes, not process. I don't do committees. I despise committees. Done. One more thing. Go ahead. The workforce training component. The program that teaches local workers to run the systems. He paused. I want that to be the foundation of the facility, not a feature. The whole point of the building is that the people in that community can maintain it themselves indefinitely. That has to be structural, not cosmetic. A pause on her end. Not hesitation, he was already learning to read her pauses. This one was the kind that meant she was recalibrating around something she hadn't expected, but recognized immediately as correct. "That's not how the framework currently reads," she said. "I know. The framework is wrong about that." Another pause. "Fix it," she said. "I will." "Anything else?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "That's everything." "Then welcome to Sterling Tech, Caleb." Howe was standing in his kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd made coffee 4 days ago, when the envelope arrived, where he'd almost told Emma to throw it in the trash, where everything had been the same as it had been for the last 8 years of a life built around survival and obligation and quiet, unglamorous love. He was still standing in the same kitchen. Everything else was different. "I'll send the corrected modeling by end of week," he said. "I'll look for it." He hung up. He set his phone face down on the counter. He made his coffee. He stood at the window and drank it slowly, watching the morning come in over the rooftops of the neighborhood he'd lived in for 8 years. The neighborhood Emma had grown up in, the neighborhood that had always felt temporary and had somehow become permanent, the way things do when you stop paying attention. I thought about the project. The real thinking, not the emotional weight of it, but the engineering. The soil composition problem in Section 4. The routing adjustments. The workforce framework that needed to be rebuilt from the center out, rather than added on at the end. He thought about the facility as a system, not as a building, not as a symbol, but as a thing that needed to work. That needed to be designed by someone who cared about the parts nobody else would think to check. I was already solving it. He'd been solving it since he read the document the night before. His brain had been running the calculations quietly while the rest of him was talking to Emma and lying awake at 3 in the morning and standing on his porch in the dark, listening to the neighborhood. This was what he did. This was who he was. The man who fixed things while nobody was watching. Except this time, someone was watching. This time, someone had specifically come to find him because they needed the thing he was best at. The quiet, structural, invisible until it fails work that kept everything else standing. He refilled his coffee. He went to his desk. He opened his laptop and started working. He called Derek Osei that afternoon. "I'm going to explain something," he said, "and I need you to not make it weird." "I make 0 promises," he told Derek. The whole thing, the scholarship, the watch, the professor's letter, the sitting room. Victoria Sterling's face when she said, "After all these years, I finally found you." Derek was quiet for a long time after he finished. "You sold Harold's watch," Derek said. "Yes. For a girl you barely knew. A person I barely knew. And she became, yes. And you never told anyone." "No." Another silence. "Caleb Thomas Whitmore," Derek said slowly, the way you say a name when you're reassessing it from scratch. "I have known you for 22 years, and I did not know you were capable of something like that. It wasn't a big thing at the time. Stop saying that. It was a big thing. Own it." He didn't say anything. "You're taking the job," Derek said. It was not a question. "Yes. Good." A pause. "Harold would have loved this." Emma said the same thing. "Emma is 17 and already smarter than most of the people in that ballroom last night, and I say that as someone who likes a fair number of people in that ballroom." Derek paused. "You know what I kept thinking about on the drive home last night after Victoria Sterling left, and the whole room spent the rest of the evening being very loudly normal while clearly losing their minds?" "What?" "I kept thinking about your slide, the one with 2 lines." A pause. "And I kept thinking the whole room was looking at that slide and seeing nothing. And now I find out that slide should have said what? That you're the reason one of the most successful companies in America exists. That you solved infrastructure problems in 5 cities that nobody ever connected to your name. That's not what the slide should have said." "Then what?" Caleb thought about it. "Father," he said. "Just that one. The rest of it, that's work. That changes." He paused. "Emma doesn't change." Derek was quiet for a moment. "You're a strange man," he said finally. "I mean that as the highest possible compliment." "I know you do. Call me when the building is done. I want to come to the opening." You'll be the first person I call." He hung up. He looked at the document spread across his desk. Pages marked, now annotated in his handwriting. Sections flagged and expanded and corrected and rebuilt. The beginning of something. He thought about Brandon Keller's face when Victoria walked past him without stopping. He didn't feel triumph about it. He wanted to maybe some small part of him that still remembered being 18 and invisible wanted to feel it. But the larger part of him, the part that had been doing the real work of his life for 20 years, felt only something quieter and more durable than triumph. Gratitude. The strange specific gratitude of a person who has spent a long time doing the right thing without reward, and has finally been handed, not the reward exactly, but the evidence that the right thing grew into something real. The scholarship had grown into a company. The company was going to grow into a facility. The facility was going to grow into... He didn't know yet. That was the thing about building something that stayed. You couldn't always see the end of it from the beginning, but you could design it to last. He picked up his pen. He went back to work. 3 weeks later, he had his first call with the full Sterling Tech project team. 11 people on a video screen. Architects, urban planners, environmental scientists, a city liaison from Columbus, a workforce development specialist. All of them with polished presentations and prepared talking points, and the particular energy of people who had been working on something for a long time and were ready to defend every decision they'd made. Victoria made the introduction brief. "This is Caleb Whitmore. He's leading the engineering design team. He's already found one critical error in the framework, and he's going to find more. Everyone report to him on technical matters." Then she stepped back. 11 sets of eyes turned to Caleb. He recognized the assessment in it. The new person in the room. The unknown quantity. The man they hadn't heard of before 3 weeks ago, who was now being handed authority over their work. He'd been in this position before. Different rooms, same dynamic. He knew exactly what they needed to see. "I've read everything," he said. "The plans, the projections, the timeline. There's good work here. There's also work that needs to be done over." A pause. "I'm not here to tell you your work was wrong. I'm here to tell you what I've found and how we fix it. The goal is a facility that will still be running correctly in 50 years. Not a facility that runs correctly on paper." He could see the moment the room shifted. The specific moment when a group of capable professionals stopped assessing and started listening. "Let me show you section 4, he said, and he pulled up the thermal modeling and he began. This was what he did. This was who he was. The man who fixed things. Except now the room was watching. Now his name was on the work. Now the thing he built was going to stand in a city in the physical world, visible and permanent and real. He thought about a pocket watch made in Illinois in 1941. He thought about what his grandfather had said. What makes a man is what he does with it. He kept going. The first time Caleb drove to Columbus, he drove alone. Emma had offered to come. She'd said it casually in the way she said things she actually meant, deeply, standing in the kitchen doorway in her socks holding a piece of toast, acting like it was nothing. "I could come, if you want company. I don't have anything on Saturday." He'd told her he was fine. She'd given him the look, the one she'd inherited from nobody, the one she'd invented herself somewhere around age 14, which said, "I know you're saying fine because you think fine is what I need to hear, and we both know that's not true, but I'll let you have it." He drove alone. The drive gave him 2.5 hours to think, which was either exactly what he needed or exactly what he didn't, depending on which part of his brain was running the assessment. The engineering part was already in Columbus, already moving through the facility layout, already working the problems, already 3 steps ahead, in the way it always was when he was close to something real. The rest of him was still catching up. He'd spent the last 3 weeks in a kind of controlled acceleration that he hadn't experienced since the early years, since before Emma, before the divorce, before he'd restructured his entire life around someone else's needs, and discovered slowly that the restructuring had cost him more than he'd accounted for. Not Emma. Never Emma. But the version of himself that had once believed he was capable of being seen. He'd stopped believing in that version. Now he was being asked to be that version again. That was the part that was harder than the engineering. The Sterling Tech project offices in Columbus were in a building downtown, converted warehouse exposed beams. The aesthetic of serious work being done by people who'd thought carefully about the environment in which they did it. Victoria's team had been operating out of the 4th floor for 8 months. By the time Caleb arrived on that first Saturday, the walls were covered in plans, and the plans were covered in arguments, highlighted sections, margin notes, colored stickers indicating unresolved questions. He stood in the middle of it for a long moment. He liked it immediately. Not the decor, or he didn't particularly care about decor. He liked the evidence of struggle. The marks of a team that had been fighting with a problem honestly, rather than pretending it was already solved. A woman appeared from behind a partition. Mid-30s natural hair pulled back the kind of steady alert energy that suggested she ran on competence rather than caffeine. She had a tablet under her arm and an expression that was professionally open welcoming without being performative about it. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm Janelle Harris, project coordinator. Victoria said you'd be coming in today." "Caleb, Mr. Whitmore is my father." "Caleb." She adjusted the tablet. "I can give you the full tour, walk you through the working documents, introduce you to whoever's here today. We run a skeleton crew on Saturdays, or I can just point you at the plans and let you go." He looked at the walls, at the plans, at the unresolved questions flagged in 3 different colors. "Point me at the plans," he said. She smiled, a real one, the kind that meant she'd made a correct assessment. "Coffee's in the back, kitchen is on your left, bathroom is straight through. I'll be at my desk if you need anything." She left him alone with it. That was exactly the right thing to do. He stayed for 6 hours. He moved through the room the way he moved through problems, methodically, but not rigidly. He let the plans tell him what they were trying to say before he started arguing with them. He read the margin notes. He looked at the flagged questions and asked himself whether the person who'd flagged them had understood the actual problem or only a symptom of it. Mostly symptoms. That wasn't a criticism. It was just how problems worked. You saw the surface disruption long before you saw the structural cause. And if you didn't know how to look through the surface, you spent your time solving the wrong thing over and over until something failed catastrophically enough to force you to go deeper. He'd spent 20 years going deeper. He filled half a legal pad with notes. Around 4 in the afternoon. Janelle came back with 2 cups of coffee and set one near him without interrupting. He picked it up without looking away from the plans and drank it, and she stood nearby for a moment, and then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The workforce development section, the training program architecture. What about it? Victoria told us you want it to be the structural foundation, not an ancillary program." A pause. "The team has been going back and forth on that. Some people think it overcomplicates the build timeline. Some people think it's the right instinct, but the wrong sequencing." She looked at him steadily. "What's your argument for it?" He set down his coffee. "What's a power grid worth?" he said, "if the people living next to it can't fix it when it breaks?" She waited. "You can build the most sophisticated energy infrastructure in the country. State-of-the-art, beautiful, efficient, everything the models say it should be. And in 15 years, when a component fails because components fail, that's not a pessimistic assumption, that's physics. The community has 2 options. They can call someone from outside, wait 3 weeks, pay 3 times what it should cost, and remain permanently dependent on expertise they never developed. Or," he looked at her, "they call someone who grew up 3 miles from the facility, who went through the training program, who knows the system because they helped build it, and who can have it running again in 48 hours. Janelle was quiet for a moment. "The second scenario requires the training program to be built into the facility design from the beginning," she said, "not added later. You can't retrofit a philosophy. You build it in, or you build something else." She nodded slowly. Not the nod of someone agreeing to be agreeable, the nod of someone whose thinking has just shifted to a new position and is settling into it. "I'll update the framework document," she said. "Tell me when it's done. I want to look at it before it goes back to Victoria." "Will do." She picked up his empty coffee cup. At the door, she paused. "The team was skeptical," she said. "When Victoria said she was bringing in someone new to lead design, People who've been on this for 8 months don't always love being told there's a new person with authority. I know. You've been in the room for 6 hours and you've already changed the way 3 people are thinking about the problem. I've been watching. A pause. They don't know that yet, but they will. She left. He turned back to the plans. He had a lot of work to do. March arrived and with it a rhythm. Tuesdays and Thursdays, he drove to Columbus. Wednesday, he worked remotely, which meant he was at his desk in the apartment before 6 in the morning and didn't stop until evening, sustained by coffee and the specific focus that came when a problem was finally revealing its actual shape. Fridays, he was home for Emma. Home in time to make dinner. Home in time to ask about her day, and mean it home in time to be whatever version of a father she needed that particular Friday, which varied considerably depending on the week. Emma was applying to colleges. This was a process that Caleb found equal parts thrilling and terrifying in the specific way that milestones in your child's life are terrifying. Not because they're bad, but because they are the physical evidence that time is moving in one direction and not stopping. She'd applied to 6 schools. 4 of them had environmental engineering programs. 2 of them were reaches, 2 were matches, 2 were safeties, which was how the school counselor had described it, and which Caleb found to be a depressingly reductive framework for a 17-year-old's future, but he was wise enough to keep that opinion to himself. On a Thursday evening, in the 3rd week of March, Emma sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and her face doing something that told Caleb from across the room that something had happened. Emma. She looked up. Ohio State came in, she said. He sat down across from her. Ohio State had an environmental engineering program that was by most assessments among the top 15 in the country. It was also 45 minutes from Columbus. And, he said. She turned the laptop around. He looked at the screen. She'd gotten in. Merit scholarship. Partial, not full, but substantial. The kind that combined with what he'd been putting aside since she was 3 years old. In a savings account, he added to every month, without exception, made the thing actually possible in the way that it needed to be possible. He looked at the screen for a moment. He looked at her. Her face was doing the complicated thing. The thing where she was happy and trying not to be overwhelmed by being happy because she was 17 and had her father's instinct toward emotional containment. Emma, he said. I know. I know, Dad. Ohio State. 45 minutes from where you're going to be working. She said it quietly. I noticed that. I noticed it too. She reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly. The same hand that had been small enough to wrap entirely around one of his fingers when she was born, which he could still feel sometimes when she touched him, the echo of that specific small weight. We're going to be okay, she said. He turned his hand over and held hers for a moment. We're going to be great, he said. She pulled her hand back and cleared her throat and looked at the laptop and said in a very different voice, Okay, I have to finish this calc homework, which was Emma's way of managing the moment before it got too large. He stood up. He made dinner. He didn't say anything else about it that night. He didn't need to. The project team's first full meeting with Caleb as the engineering lead happened on a Wednesday in early April in the Columbus office, with all 11 members present, plus Victoria on video from San Francisco, where she had back-to-back meetings from 6 in the morning. Caleb had prepared for 3 days. Not the way you prepare for a presentation, not slides and bullet points and talking point outlines. The way he prepared was to dismantle the current framework completely in his head. Understand why each decision had been made. Find where the logic broke down and rebuild it correctly before anyone else got there. He'd done this with the thermal modeling in Section 4. He'd done it with the underground routing. He'd done it with the community integration timeline, which had been structured sequentially when it needed to be parallel, and with the contractor selection process, which had been designed in a way that would inevitably favor large outside firms over local ones. He'd done it with 15 separate problems. He came to the meeting with 15 separate solutions. The team's lead architect was a man named Paul Reeder. 52. Boston trained 40 pounds of professional confidence on a frame built for it. He'd been on the project from the beginning. He had the particular manner of someone who'd been the smartest person in most rooms he'd entered, and had allowed this to become structural in his personality. He and Caleb had already had 3 conversations via email that had been technically polite and substantively combative. Paul spoke first. "I've reviewed the corrections to Section 4, the thermal modeling. I want to understand the methodology." "Go ahead." "Your coefficient adjustment accounts for Ohio clay composition below the frost line. That's correct for standard soil conditions." He paused. "But the site geology shows limestone bedrock at 11 feet in the northeast quadrant. You've applied a uniform adjustment across the full site." Caleb looked at him. "Page 7 of my notes, second paragraph." Paul looked down at the document in front of him. He found page 7. He read it. His expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough. "You accounted for the bedrock variation." "I accounted for all 4 geological zones across the site. The correction in Section 4 applies a variable coefficient by zone, not a uniform one. The summary table shows the aggregate impact, which is why it reads as uniform. The underlying calculation is not." A pause. "That's..." Paul stopped. "That's more thorough than the original modeling." "It needs to be. This building is going to be running in 50 years, not 12. On the video screen, Victoria was watching. She wasn't speaking. She was watching the way she watched things with the focused attention of someone who was collecting information about multiple things at once. "The routing changes in Section 7, said another team member. The structural engineer, a quiet woman named Sarah Chen, who had said almost nothing in previous meetings, and now said it with the efficiency of someone who chose their moments carefully. "The revision adds complexity to the underground pathway. That has build timeline implications." "It does," Caleb said. 14 additional days in Phase 2. "That pushes us past the winter window. It pushes us to the edge of the winter window, not past it." He turned to the relevant page. "If we restructure the Phase 2 crew allocation, which I've outlined on page 11, we absorb the 14 days without compromising the winter deadline. It requires running 2 sub-crews in parallel on the northeast quadrant rather than sequential." Sarah looked at page 11. She looked at the allocation table. "That increases labor costs by 8% in that phase," she said. 6.4%, he said. "The table on page 12 accounts for efficiency gains from parallel operation. I've been conservative. Real-world parallel efficiency in comparable projects has run higher." Sarah Chen studied the page for a long moment. Then she nodded. Not to him specifically, just to the truth of the numbers, which is the only kind of nodding that matters when you're talking about things that will eventually bear physical weight. The meeting ran for 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was 90 minutes longer than scheduled. Caleb answered every question with the same precision. Not the precision of a person performing competence, but the precision of someone who had lived with the problem long enough that the answers were simply present, available, solid. At the end, Paul Reeder gathered his documents in the way that a person gathers things when they're thinking about something else entirely. Then he looked at Caleb. "The workforce training integration," he said. "The restructured framework. I was resistant to it initially." "I know. I've read the revised document 3 times. A pause. "It's correct. The way you've built it with the training pathways embedded in the facility design rather than housed separately. It changes the relationship between the building and the community fundamentally. It makes the building," he searched for the word. "It makes it a living thing, not a monument. That's the idea." "It's good engineering," Paul said. "I want you to know I recognize that." Coming from Paul Reeder, this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Caleb recognized it as such. "Appreciate it," he said. "I need your structural expertise on the northeast quadrant load distribution. That's the hardest problem we have left." "I know." A pause. "I've been thinking about it." "Good. Let's set up time this week." Paul nodded, and something in his posture settled, not diminishment, but recalibration. The specific adjustment a man makes when he stops assessing whether someone is worthy of respect, and starts engaging with them as a peer. On the video screen, Victoria Sterling said exactly nothing, but she was smiling. The month of April was the month Caleb learned what it meant to lead. He'd thought he knew. He'd consulted on enough teams, solved enough problems, handed enough solutions to enough project managers who then walked into rooms and presented the work as their own. He'd understood the mechanics of leadership from the outside. The inside was different, said. The inside meant that when Sarah Chen came to him on a Tuesday afternoon with a structural concern that if she was right would require rethinking 4 months of work, he couldn't walk away from the problem. He had to stay in it. He had to hear her completely, follow her reasoning to its conclusion. Determine whether she was right, she was partially, and then figure out how to reshape the work without dismantling the timeline. He stayed in the Columbus office until 11 that night. Janelle brought him dinner from a place down the street around 8. A container of something warm placed quietly near him, the same way she'd placed the coffee on that first Saturday. She had a gift for resource provision that never intruded on the work, which was an underrated skill. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know." Sarah's concern, "Is it fixable?" "Yes." "Do you know how yet?" "I'm working on it." She sat down across from him, which surprised him slightly. Janelle was meticulous about professional boundaries, present when needed, absent when not. Sitting down uninvited meant something. "Can I say something off the record?" "Go ahead." "The team is different since you came in." She paused. "And I want to be clear, different in a good way, but not in the obvious way. It's not that you're smarter than the people who were here before. It's that you—" She looked for the word. "You care about the parts no one's going to photograph, the parts that make it work in the ground, and in winter, and in 15 years. And when people see someone with authority caring about those parts, they start caring about them too." He looked at her. "The team has gotten better," she continued. "Not because you corrected them, because you showed them what it looks like to care about the whole thing, not the visible thing, the real thing." He was quiet for a moment. "Janelle." "Yes." "Does Sarah's concern affect the workforce training framework?" A pause while she thought about it. "Potentially the Phase 3 integration timeline. If the structural changes push Phase 3, it won't push Phase 3. He turned back to his notes. "Give me 2 more hours." She stood up. "The food will get cold. I'll eat while I work." She left. He ate while he worked. He found the solution at 9:47, a load redistribution approach that accommodated Sarah's concern, maintained the Phase 3 timeline, and actually improved the long-term stability of the Northeast Foundation by 11% over the original design. He sent the revised calculations to Paul and Sarah at 10:15 with a note that read, "Review before Thursday. This fixes the concern and adds value we didn't plan for. Sarah, good catch." He drove home at 11. He was in his apartment by 1:30 in the morning, and he sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a few minutes before going to bed. He thought about how strange it was to be doing the same work he'd always done, solving the same kinds of problems he'd always solved, and to have it feel entirely different, because now there were people in the room who knew it was him doing it, who were watching him work, who were being affected by the way he worked. He'd been invisible so long that visibility felt like a new language. He was learning it one word at a time. In the second week of April, Brandon Keller called him. He almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved in his phone, but he recognized it from the reunion. Brandon had insisted on exchanging numbers at the end of the evening, when the room's recalibration was already complete, when he'd morphed seamlessly from the man who'd made the joke about shop class into a man who had apparently always respected Caleb Whitmore. He answered. "Caleb. Hey. Brandon Keller." "I know." "Yeah, of course. Listen, how are you? How's everything going with I saw the announcement in the Columbus paper. The Sterling Tech facility. They mentioned your name." "I know." That's a big deal. That's a really big deal." A pause. "I have to be honest with you. I've been thinking about you since the reunion, about what I said, the joke I made." Caleb waited. I was out of line. I want you to know that. What I said was, I was an idiot. I'm sorry." The apology sat in the air between them. Caleb thought about it honestly. He thought about what it cost a man like Brandon Keller to make a call like this, the specific pride that would have had to bend for him to dial the number. He thought about whether the apology was real, or whether it was the updated version of Brandon's original move repositioning himself now that the room's opinion had changed. He thought about it and decided he didn't know which it was, and that it ultimately didn't matter. "Brandon," he said, "I've been called worse by people I respected more. It didn't keep me up at night." A pause. "That's okay." "Yeah." Another pause. "I'm glad you're doing well, man. I genuinely am." "I appreciate that. If you ever need, real estate in Columbus, I have contacts. Property development if the facility needs. I'll keep it in mind." "Right, of course. Well, good luck, Caleb. Really." "Thanks, Brandon." He hung up. He stared at his phone for a moment. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel angry. He felt approximately nothing about Brandon Keller, which was, he thought, the exact right amount. Emma's prom was on a Friday in May, which meant Caleb was home. He'd planned for it, structured his Columbus schedule around it 3 months in advance, with the same meticulous attention he gave to project timelines, because Emma's life was the original project, the one everything else organized around. She'd gone with a group of friends. No specific date, a choice she'd made on her own terms, and explained to him as, "It's more fun without the drama," which he accepted completely. He helped her with the back of her dress, a complicated system of small buttons that required more fine motor control than his engineering work usually demanded. She stood at the mirror in the hallway, and he worked the buttons from the bottom up carefully, the way he'd once learned to do the smallest clasps on the smallest hand when she was small enough that everything required that degree of care. "You're good at this," she said. "I've had practice." She looked at his face in the mirror. "Dad." "Yeah." "Are you going to cry?" "Absolutely not." She tilted her head. "Little bit," he admitted. She laughed, the full one, not the managed one. The one she'd had since she was 6 years old, the laugh that took up the whole room. He finished the buttons. She turned around and looked at him, and he looked at her, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was not something that had words in any language. It was simply the weight of 17 years of being each other's whole team. The accumulated evidence of 10,000 ordinary mornings and difficult evenings and soccer games and homework and bad days and good ones, all of it present simultaneously in the 10 seconds they stood in the hallway. "You're going to be great," she said. Exactly what he'd said to her about Ohio State. He cleared his throat. "Go," he said. "Your friends are waiting." She went. He stood in the hallway for a while after the door closed. Then he called Victoria. Not for any professional reason. He called because he'd found over the months since the reunion that Victoria Sterling was one of 4 people in the world he could call when he needed to say something out loud to someone who would understand exactly what he meant. The other 3 were Derek, Janelle, and Emma herself, though he was careful about the weight he put on Emma because she was 17 and entitled to a life that wasn't organized around managing her father's emotions. Victoria picked up on the 3rd ring. "Prom night," she said immediately. "How'd the dress buttons go?" He'd mentioned it 2 weeks ago, apparently in more detail than he'd realized. "Successfully." "Did you cry?" "I'm not answering that." "That's a yes." He could hear the warmth in it. "She's going to be incredible, Caleb. You know that." "I know." "How are you actually outside of the project, outside of Emma?" He thought about the question honestly. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm still figuring out what that is, who that is." "That's fair." "I've been a father and a consultant for so long that everything else feels theoretical. Like I understand the concept of it, but I haven't built it yet." "That's very on brand for you, treating yourself like an engineering problem." He almost smiled. "Maybe. For what it's worth, the person I've watched for the last 4 months in the project meetings with the team, that person is not theoretical. That person is very much built and very much real." A pause. "You just haven't seen it from the outside before." He sat with that for a moment. "Victoria." "Yeah." "The facility. The opening." When it's done and it's going to be done right, I need you to know that I know. I want the first people through the doors to be from the community, not press, not donors, not partners, the local residents, the people who live there. A pause. That was already the plan, she said. It's been in the framework since you rewrote it. He nodded, even though she couldn't see it. Good, he said. Go home and eat something, Caleb. Stop calling me from your car. How did you know I was in my car? Because you're always in your car when you call me, and there's nothing to say, but you need to say something. It's very identifiable. A pause. Go home. Yeah. He paused. Thanks. Always. He drove home. He ate something. I went to bed before midnight for the first time in 3 weeks. The summer came in fast. Emma graduated on a Saturday morning at the end of June. Cap and gown, the whole apparatus, sitting in a stadium with 500 other seniors, while the principal said the kinds of things principals say, and the sun moved overhead, and Caleb sat in the bleachers with Derek Osai's wife on one side and an empty seat on the other, because some people aren't at the things they should be at, and he'd made a long peace with that fact, even if the empty seat still had a physical weight to it. Emma found him afterward in the crowd. She still had her cap on tassel swinging. She looked at him and said, "Hi, Dad." "Hi, kid." She put her arms around him. They stood like that for a moment in the middle of 500 people, and the noise and the sunlight, and the cameras, and all the ordinary extraordinary chaos of a day that marks the end of one thing and the beginning of another. He held on. He let go when she let go. "Ohio State in 8 weeks, she said. 8 weeks. You're going to be fine, she said. I know. You're not going to be fine. I know that too. She laughed. She straightened his collar, which had come slightly askew when she hugged him, because she was 17 years old and already taking care of him the way she'd been doing quietly for years. The building, she said. How much longer? 12 months, maybe 14. And then the opening. And then the opening. She looked at him. I want to be there, she said. At the opening, front row. He looked at her, this person he'd built his whole life around, who was now standing at the edge of her own life, and looking back at him with the specific expression of someone who has already begun stepping forward but hasn't let go of your hand yet. Front row, he said. First through the doors. Deal. She turned and ran back toward her friend's cap, still on gown, trailing the laugh preceding her across the field. He stood there watching her go. He thought about what it meant to build something that stayed. He thought about a pocket watch, and a scholarship, and a 2-line slide on a hotel ballroom screen, and a woman who'd walked across a room to find the person everyone had overlooked. He thought about the facility taking shape in Columbus, the underground routing the parallel subcrews in the northeast quadrant, the workforce training pathways embedded in the architecture itself. I thought about 50 years from now. He thought about a community running its own systems. He thought about people who would never know his name, whose lives would be different because he'd done the work correctly. He thought that's enough. He thought that's always been enough. He pulled out his phone and sent Janelle a message that said, "Back full-time Monday." "Let's talk about Phase 2 crew allocation." She replied in 4 minutes, already scheduled. "Coffee will be ready." He smiled at his phone. He found Derek in the crowd. They shook hands, then Derek pulled him into the kind of hug that men give each other when words are insufficient and they've known each other long enough to know it. "Phase 2 starts Monday," Caleb said when they separated. "You ready?" He thought about it honestly. "Yeah," he said. "I'm ready." He drove to Columbus that afternoon. He didn't wait until Monday. There was work to do. Phase 2 started on a Monday morning in July, with the kind of heat that made the air above the construction site shimmer and bend, and Caleb was there at 6:15, which was 45 minutes before anyone else arrived, standing at the edge of the northeast quadrant, with a hard hat and a copy of the revised routing plans, and the specific stillness of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. He'd been on construction sites before, many of them, but always as the consultant who showed up, assessed, corrected, and left. The person who fixed the invisible thing and disappeared before anyone thought to ask his name. This was different. This site had his name on the permit. He stood there in the early morning heat and looked at the ground at the marked perimeters, the surveyor's flags, the chalk lines indicating where the underground systems would go, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Ownership. Not the legal kind. The deeper kind. The kind that means I am responsible for whether this works. The crew chief, a man named Roy Hadley, arrived at 6:58 and found Caleb already in conversation with one of the surveyors about a discrepancy between the site markings and the revised routing document from the previous week. Roy was 61 years old, had been building things in central Ohio for 37 years, and had the manner of a man who had seen enough engineers show up on job sites to have formed a comprehensive and largely unfavorable opinion of the species. He stood nearby and listened for approximately 90 seconds. Then he walked over. "Hadley," he said, extending his hand. "You're Whitmore." "Caleb. You're the one who added 14 days to my Phase 2. I'm the one who kept your foundation from failing in 15 years. Roy looked at him for a moment. His face did not change. Then he looked at the survey discrepancy they'd been discussing. "What's the problem?" Caleb showed him. The revised routing document had been updated 3 days ago, but the site markings reflected the previous version. 2 of the chalk lines in the northeast quadrant were off by 8 inches, which in the context of limestone bedrock at 11 feet was not a cosmetic issue. Roy crouched down and looked at the markings. He stood back up. He turned to the surveyor. "Redo the northeast quadrant before we break ground. All of it." The surveyor nodded and left. Roy turned back to Caleb. "You got here at 6:15. "Why?" "Because I wanted to see it before it got loud." Roy studied him for a moment with the measured assessment of a man who had learned to read people the way Caleb read engineering documents, looking for structural integrity, looking for the place where the logic broke down, looking for whether what was presented on the surface matched what was actually going on underneath. "You know what your problem is going to be," Roy said. It was not a question. "Tell me." "The parallel sub-crew operation in the northeast quadrant. I've run parallel crews in this kind of soil before. The coordination window is tighter than your document suggests. You've got it modeled at 72-hour cycles. Real world, you're looking at 84 to 90. Caleb looked at the plans. He looked at the site. He ran it in his head. "What's your recommendation?" Roy blinked. It was the small thing, barely perceptible. But Caleb caught it because he'd learned to catch it. It was the blink of a man who had given recommendations to engineers for 37 years and had rarely been asked for one directly. "Stagger the sub-crew start times by 6 hours instead of 12. You lose some parallel efficiency, but you gain coordination. Net result, you might add 3 days instead of the 14 I'd normally expect." Caleb thought about it for 10 seconds. "Do it your way," he said. "I'll revise the timeline document by end of day." Another brief assessment from Roy Hadley. "You're not what I expected," Roy said. "What did you expect? Someone who'd tell me my 37 years were less important than his spreadsheet. Your 37 years are the most important data set on this site." Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hard hat on. 6:15 is early," he said. "I get here at 6. I'll be here at 5:55 tomorrow." The corner of Roy's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Close enough. "Coffee's in the trailer," he said. "It's bad coffee. I'll survive." Roy walked toward the crew gathering at the equipment bay, already calling out instructions in the voice of a man who knew how to make a construction site understand that the day had started. Caleb watched him go. Then he turned back to the revised markings and got to work. The summer moved the way. Summers move when you're doing something real fast and slow, simultaneously each day, feeling both brief and enormous. Caleb's world had reorganized itself around the site schedule. The project meetings, the constant stream of problems that a construction project of this complexity generated the way, weather generated itself, continuously, naturally, without asking permission. He'd moved to Columbus full-time in July, a week after Emma's graduation. The apartment he'd rented was smaller than his old one, which was fine because he was rarely in it. He slept there and made coffee there and read engineering documents there at 11 at night, and that was most of what he needed. Emma had helped him move in on a Saturday in late June, which meant she'd carried boxes while he assembled furniture, and they'd argued pleasantly about whether the desk should face the window or the wall. He wanted the window, she said. She said the wall was better for concentration. She was right. He admitted it. They ordered pizza and ate it on boxes because he hadn't unpacked the kitchen yet. Before she left, she stood in the middle of the nearly arranged apartment and turned around slowly, taking it in. "It's good," she said. "It's a good space for you." "You think so?" "It smells like a place where work gets done. That's a compliment." He walked her to her car. She was leaving to spend 2 weeks with her mother before coming back for a college orientation program at Ohio State, which was its own complicated geography. He'd had to learn to navigate the specific emotional terrain of sharing your child's milestones with a person you'd unmade a marriage with, doing it politely and completely, and without the damage of old grievances, because Emma deserved parents who could stand in the same room at graduation without the air going wrong. They'd managed it mostly. Some years better than others. This year well enough. "Call me when you get there," he said. "Dad, it's 2.5 hours. Call me when you get there. You're going to be insufferable when I'm in Columbus, and you can show up whenever you want." "I'll be restrained." She gave him a look. "I'll try," he said. She drove away. He went back inside. He sat at the desk, facing the wall, which was better for concentration, and opened his laptop and worked until 1 in the morning on the staggered sub-crew schedule revision that he'd promised Roy by end of day and had been refining ever since. He sent it at 1:17. Roy replied at 1:32. "Up late yourself. Looks right. See you at 6. Caleb smiled at his screen. He went to sleep. August brought heat and momentum and the first real crisis. It arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a phone call from Paul Reeder at 7 in the morning while Caleb was still in his car in the site parking lot finishing a cup of coffee. "We have a problem," Paul said without preamble, which told Caleb it was serious because Paul Reeder almost always had a preamble. "Tell me." The city liaison called this morning. Environmental compliance review. "There's a question about the groundwater monitoring requirements for the northeast quadrant, the limestone bedrock situation. The city's saying the current plan doesn't meet the updated state requirements that went into effect in January. If they're right, we have to redesign the monitoring network." Caleb set down his coffee. "How long has the liaison known about the January update?" A pause. "That's unclear." Paul. "Since February, approximately." Caleb closed his eyes for 3 seconds. Not in frustration, in calculation. He was already running the problem. "Who's the liaison?" "Marcus Webb, City Infrastructure Office." "Set up a meeting, today if possible, tomorrow at the latest." "I can try." "Not try, set it up." He got out of the car. He was at the site by 7:15. He found Janelle in the project office reviewing the morning's delivery schedule. "You heard," she said. "Just now, how bad is it?" Janelle was precise about these assessments, which was one of the things he'd come to rely on. She didn't catastrophize, and she didn't minimize. She gave you the geometry of the problem. If the monitoring network needs to be fully redesigned, we lose the Northeast Quadrant timeline. That pushes Phase 3, which pushes the workforce training program build-out, which pushes the community engagement launch. She paused. 6 to 8 months potentially. He stood very still. And if the redesign is partial, if we can retrofit the existing plan, that depends on exactly what the updated requirements specify, which is what we don't know yet. Get me the January regulatory update, full text. I'll have read it before the meeting with Webb. It's already in your email. I sent it when Paul called you. He looked at her. I sent it to you first, she said. Then I called Paul. He nodded. Thank you, Janelle. The monitoring network redesign, if it comes to that, who's the right person to lead it? Me. You're already leading the full design team. Then I'm also leading the monitoring network redesign. She looked at him for a moment. Not doubtfully, she'd been past doubt for months. More like she was registering something. You don't have to take everything on yourself, she said. The northeast quadrant is the most complex section of this build. If something goes wrong with the monitoring there and the groundwater is affected, we've caused damage to the community we're supposed to be helping. That's not something I delegate. She was quiet. Okay, she said. I'll restructure the weekly check-ins to account for the additional workload. Don't restructure anything yet. Let me read the regulation first. He went to his desk. He read the January regulatory update in 45 minutes. All of it, every clause, every reference document, every technical specification. He flagged 12 relevant passages. He compared them against the current monitoring plan. At 8:47 he called Paul. We don't need a full redesign, he said. You read the whole document in. We need to add 3 monitoring stations in the northeast quadrant and increase the sampling frequency in the existing network from quarterly to monthly. It's a scope expansion, not a fundamental change. A pause. It adds cost, approximately $80,000. It does not add significant time if we move the procurement for the monitoring equipment forward by 4 weeks. Silence. The current equipment procurement schedule. I know what the current schedule says. I'm telling you what the revised one needs to say. Can you get Webb on the phone today? I'll call him now. I want to be on the call. The meeting with Marcus Webb happened at 2 that afternoon via video. Webb was a city official who appeared to have spent a significant portion of his career being the person who brought regulatory complications to projects and was therefore accustomed to a particular quality of response. Usually defensive, sometimes aggressive, occasionally both. He was not accustomed to the response he got from Caleb. Caleb came to the meeting with the regulatory language cited precisely, the compliance gap identified specifically, the solution proposed concisely, and the cost and timeline impact calculated in advance. He did not express frustration about the late notification. He did not perform cooperativeness. He simply presented what needed to happen, why, and how. Webb, who had prepared for a different kind of meeting, went slightly off his usual script. You've already worked out the solution. The solution was in the regulation. I read the regulation. Most projects at this stage push back on the compliance requirement. They contest the timeline request extensions. This project is not going to cut corners on groundwater monitoring next to a community it's supposed to serve. That's not a position we're going to revisit. A pause. I need the city's expedited approval for the modified monitoring plan. What's the process and who do I talk to? Webb blinked. I can put you in touch with the compliance office directly. Given the circumstances, the late notification, I think expedited review is reasonable. I appreciate that. I'll have the modified plan submitted by Friday. He did. He submitted it Thursday. The city approved it the following Wednesday. They lost 11 days on the Northeast Quadrant schedule. Not 6 to 8 months, 11 days, which Roy Hadley absorbed with a crew adjustment that cost them nothing in timeline. Victoria called him the morning after the approval. Paul told me about the regulatory crisis. It wasn't a crisis, it was a compliance gap. Paul used the word crisis. Paul is thorough. Sometimes thoroughness looks like alarm. He also told me you read a 40-page regulatory document in 45 minutes and had a solution before the meeting. It wasn't 40 pages, it was 31. Caleb. Victoria. How are you doing actually? He thought about it. He was sitting on the edge of the construction site on an overturned equipment bucket in the afternoon heat, watching Roy Hadley direct a subcrew through a section of underground routing in the southeast quadrant. The work moved with the efficiency of people who knew what they were doing and trusted the plan they were executing. I'm good, he said, and meant it. The project is on track. 11 days behind the Northeast Quadrant subschedule. On track everywhere else. We'll recover the 11 days in Phase 3. You're certain? I'm certain. A pause. I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear it without deflecting, she said. I'll try. What you've done with this team in 4 months, the way they work now, the way they think about problems. Paul Reeder sent me an email last week. Unprompted, he said, and I'm going to quote this directly. I've been in this industry 30 years. Whitmore is the best engineering mind I've worked beside. Not the flashiest, the best. A pause. Paul Reeder does not say things like that. Paul Reeder barely says things like that about himself. Caleb watched Roy direct the crew. Paul is good at what he does, he said. So are you. And you're getting better at letting people see it. He didn't answer immediately. It's still strange, he said. Being seen. I know. It was strange for me too the first few years. You get used to it. I'm not sure I want to get used to it. I don't want it to change how I work. It won't. You're too stubborn. That's not a compliment. It absolutely is. He almost laughed. The opening, he said. I've been thinking about it. Tell me. I want the workforce training cohort, the first class, the people who've been going through the program while the facility's been built. I want them to lead the opening tour. Not me, not the project team, not the design leads. The people who are going to run the systems long term. A silence on her end. That's going to be a press moment, she said carefully. The media will be expecting. I know what they'll be expecting. I'm telling you what I think should happen. It changes the optics of the event. Good. The optics should belong to the community, not the engineers. A longer pause. Done, she said. Just like that. Caleb. It's a better idea than what we had planned. Of course it's done. He nodded. There's one more thing, he said. There always is. The first cohort, 22 people. I've been working with them alongside the construction, giving them access to the build as it progresses, so they understand the systems from the inside out, not just from a manual. He paused. There's a man in the cohort. His name is James. He's 58. He worked manufacturing in Columbus for 26 years. The plant closed in 2019. He's been doing contingency work since then. Okay. He's going to be the best systems technician this facility has ever had. Possibly the best in the city. A pause. I want to make sure that's on record. That when the press asks about the workforce program, his name comes up, not mine. Victoria was quiet for a moment. His name will come up, she said. I'll make sure of it. Thank you. Caleb. Yeah. What your grandfather would say right now. Don't. I know what he'd say. You don't need to say it. A pause. Fine. A warmth in it. Go back to work. Already there. He hung up. He looked at the site. James Alderton was in the northeast quadrant, 3 weeks into his practical rotation, standing beside one of the senior installers, and watching the underground routing procedure, with the focused attention of a man who understood that he was learning something he intended to keep for the rest of his life. Caleb watched him for a moment. He thought about a 22-year-old standing in a university hallway, looking through a door. He stood up and walked toward the northeast quadrant. September arrived, and Emma started at Ohio State. He drove her to Columbus on a Sunday, her car loaded with the particular cargo of a college freshman bedding, and a mini-fridge and a desk lamp, and more pairs of shoes than the storage situation could reasonably accommodate, and a photograph in a small frame that she put on her desk before she unpacked anything else. The photograph was from his company's first day on the construction site. He didn't know she had it. She'd apparently gotten it from Janelle, who had apparently taken it on that first July morning. Caleb in his hard hat at the edge of the northeast quadrant, looking at the ground completely unaware of the camera. You look like you're talking to it, Emma said. The ground. Like you're telling it what you're going to do. I probably was. Mentally. I love it. She set it on the desk. That's you in your element. I wanted to keep it. He looked at the photograph for a moment. The man in it didn't look like what he'd been told he looked like at a reunion 13 months ago. The man in it looked like someone who knew exactly where he was standing and exactly why. He helped her set up her desk. He assembled the shelf unit. He made 3 trips to the car. He refused to carry the last box because she was an adult and he was practicing. At the door, she turned around. Dad? Yeah. Go build your building. He nodded. Go build yours, he said. She smiled the full one. He left before he could do anything embarrassing. He drove to the construction site. It was a Sunday, which meant a skeleton crew. Roy Hadley was there because Roy was always there, because Roy Hadley had been building things in central Ohio for 37 years and had apparently not yet identified a Sunday that couldn't benefit from checking on the week's work. Roy looked at Caleb when he arrived. "Kid starts today. Already dropped her off." Roy nodded. They stood at the edge of the site together, looking at what had risen in the months since July, the structural shell of the northeast quadrant fully framed. Now the underground routing. Complete, the monitoring stations installed and operational. The workforce training wing taking shape from its foundation, with the kind of specificity that came from having been designed into the building rather than added to it. It looked like something. It looked like a real thing. "How much longer?" Roy said. 8 months, maybe 9. "Your schedule says 8. "My schedule is right. 9 is if something goes wrong. Something always goes wrong. "Then 9. Roy looked at the building for a moment. "In 37 years, he said in the particular voice of a man who doesn't make this kind of statement often, "I've built 31 major structures, hospitals, transit hubs, industrial facilities." A pause. "This is the one I'm going to want to see in 20 years, to see if it worked." Caleb looked at him. "It'll work," he said. "I know it will. That's why I want to see it." They stood together in the Sunday quiet for a moment. Then Roy said, "Coffee's in the trailer," and walked back toward the crew. Caleb stood at the edge of the site alone. He looked at the building. "I thought about James Alderton in the northeast quadrant, learning the underground routing with the focused attention of a man who intended to keep what he was learning. He thought about 21 other people in the first training cohort, welders, electricians, HVAC technicians, a former school bus driver who turned out to have a near supernatural instinct for systems diagnostics. He thought about the community that lived within a mile of the site, the people who'd come to the public engagement sessions that Janelle had organized, who'd asked good questions and skeptical questions and hopeful questions and questions about whether this was one of those things that happened to a neighborhood and then left. I thought about what he'd told every one of them when they asked, "This building belongs to you." Not in the legal sense, in the real sense. The people who know how to run it live in your neighborhood. The people who designed it thought about your lives, not just the spec sheet. And when something needs fixing in 15 years, the person who fixes it is going to be someone you know. He believed that. He'd built it to be true. October. The project had settled into what Roy called the execution phase, past the complexity of foundations and underground systems, into the detailed and demanding work of making the interior match the vision. This was the phase Caleb found most absorbing because it was the phase where the invisible became visible, where the routing and the wiring and the monitoring systems that had been underground began to connect to the surfaces where people would actually live and work. He spent a Tuesday afternoon with James Alderton, doing a walkthrough of the completed northeast quadrant systems, the groundwater monitoring stations, the thermal distribution, routing the backup redundancy pathways that meant the building's core systems could continue operating if any one component failed. James had been through the technical training. He'd done the practical rotation. He knew the documentation. What Caleb was checking now was different. He was checking understanding, not recitation of facts, actual structural understanding. Whether James knew not just what each system did, but why it was designed the way it was. What would happen if it was adjusted incorrectly? What the signs of a developing problem looked like 4 stages before it became a failure. He walked James through the northeast monitoring array. He asked questions. James answered them not quickly, not with the smooth fluency of someone performing knowledge. He answered with the measured deliberateness of someone who had thought through each thing and was giving Caleb the actual contents of his thinking. He was right about 90% of it. The 10% he wasn't right about were interesting, not basic errors, but conceptual gaps that existed in specific places, which meant they could be specifically addressed. They talked through each one. James listened the way people listen when they're genuinely learning, not waiting for the end of the sentence, not nodding along to be agreeable, actually taking it in, incorporating it. The redundancy pathway in Zone 3, James said at one point. The way you've routed it, it bypasses the primary thermal bus entirely. Yes. So if the primary thermal bus fails in winter, the Zone 3 redundancy maintains heat distribution to the community interface points. The residents don't lose heating. They might not even know something failed. James looked at the routing for a moment. That's why you added the 14 days, he said. Caleb looked at him. Paul, one of the architects he mentioned there, was a timeline extension in Phase 2, for routing changes. James looked at the pathway. This is what that was for, this specific routing. Yes, 14 days, so the people in the building don't lose heat in January. 14 days, so the people in the community don't lose heat in January. James stood quietly for a moment. Mr. Whitmore. Caleb. Caleb. He paused. Why this job? Why not something bigger? I mean, you could be doing? I've looked up your background. You've worked on systems in Pittsburgh, Louisville. Projects 3 times this size. Why here? Caleb thought about how to answer that honestly. Because here is where it needs to be done, he said. And because the right question isn't how big the project is. It's whether the project matters to the people it's for. James nodded slowly. And it does, he said. I hope so. That's what we built it for. James looked around the northeast quadrant at the systems he'd spent months learning at the monitoring stations. He could now read like a language at the routing that would keep the building running long after the people who designed it had moved on. I'm going to take care of it, he said. It was a simple sentence, completely declarative. No performance in it. Caleb believed it completely. I know you will, he said. November came in cold, the way Ohio. November comes in committed, unambiguous, reminding you that winter in the Midwest is not a suggestion. The building's exterior was complete. The interior work was in its final quarter. The workforce training program had graduated its first cohort, 22 people, James Alderton among them, now formally certified and assigned to the facilities operations team. Caleb had attended the certification ceremony. It was held in the facility's main training room, folding chairs, a podium. Someone had borrowed from a local church bad lighting that Janelle had supplemented with additional floor lamps, which improved things considerably. The 22 people and their families occupied the chairs. Their faces had the particular quality of people who have worked hard at something real and are now being formally told, yes, this counts. Victoria attended via video, which she'd insisted on despite having 3 other commitments that day. Janelle ran the ceremony with the efficiency and warmth that she brought to everything. Caleb said a few words. He'd prepared them carefully, not because he was nervous about speaking, but because he wanted each person in the room to hear something specific and true rather than something generic and forgettable. He talked about the Northeast Quadrant routing. He talked about the 14 days and why they'd been added. He talked about Zone 3 redundancy and what it meant in January when the temperature dropped below freezing. He said, "The people who designed this building will move on to other projects, but you are permanent. You are the reason this works indefinitely. Not the engineers, you." He saw James Alderton in the 3rd row. James was looking at him with the expression of a man who has just had something confirmed that he'd begun to suspect but hadn't yet been told directly. Caleb held his gaze for a moment, then he moved on. After the ceremony, one of the graduates, a woman named Rita, 44, who had come to the program from a background in HVAC maintenance and had turned out to have an extraordinarily precise diagnostic mind, came up to him and said, "My daughter wants to be an engineer." "How old?" 14. "Tell her to come by the facility. I'll show her what engineering actually looks like." Rita looked at him. "You'd do that?" "Yes." "Why?" He thought about how to say it simply. "Because someone did something for me once without being asked, and the only way to repay it is to do something for someone else." Rita studied him for a moment. "Bring your daughter any Saturday," he said. "I'm usually here." She nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it." I didn't know how to receive that gracefully. He was still learning. "The building thanks you back," he said. "You're why it works." December, 3 months from opening. Caleb was at his desk at 10:30 on a Thursday night working through the final systems integration report when his phone rang. He picked it up without looking at the screen because at 10:30 on a Thursday night, the only people who called were people with problems. Dad. Emma's voice. Not the managed voice, the real one. He sat forward. What happened? Nothing bad. Nothing's wrong. A pause, and he could hear her recalibrating, stepping back from whatever emotion had made her dial. I needed to hear your voice for a second. Sorry. Don't apologize. It's late and you're working. Emma, don't apologize. A pause. I had a rough study session, she said. Thermodynamics. The professor went fast, and I thought I understood it, and then I got home and opened my notes, and I didn't understand it. Okay, tell me where it broke down. Dad, I didn't call you to solve my thermodynamics problem. I know, but I can. Tell me where it broke down. A pause. Then, with the particular mixture of exasperation and relief that only a child who loves their parent can produce, she told him. They talked through it for 40 minutes. He didn't give her the answer, he walked her through the logic, the same way he walked through all problems, from the structural level down to the specific, letting the understanding build, rather than installing it. By the end, she had it. Oh, she said. Oh, that's why didn't he just say it like that? Different people build explanations differently. You build good ones. I've had good material to work with. A pause. Dad? Yeah, the opening is in March. March 15th. I'll be there. Front row, first through the doors. Deal. A pause. Go to sleep at a reasonable time. I'll try. That's a no. That's a try. She laughed the full one, even through the phone, even at 10:30 on a Thursday night after a bad study session. Love you, she said. Love you. He sat at his desk after she hung up. He thought about March 15th. He thought about 22 people who now knew how to run the systems he'd designed. He thought about Rita's 14-year-old daughter who had come by on 3 consecutive Saturdays and had asked better questions than half the engineers he'd worked beside. He thought about James Alderton in the Northeast Quadrant, learning the routing until it was part of him. He thought about a building that would run in 50 years. He thought about a community that would know how to keep it running. He thought about his grandfather's voice, clear and steady and calm, the way it had always been the voice of a man who believed that what you built with your hands and your mind and your choices was the truest thing about you. What makes a man is what he does with it. He turned back to his screen. He finished the systems integration report. He sent it to Paul and Janelle and Roy at 11:47 with a note at the bottom that said, "Good work. 3 months. Let's finish it right." I went to sleep. He was at the site at 6 the next morning. March 15th arrived the way important days always arrive, looking exactly like every other morning until it didn't. Caleb was at the facility at 5:45. Not because anything needed to be done at 5:45 that couldn't have been done at 7. But because he needed an hour with the building before it stopped being his and became what it was always meant to become, something that belonged to everyone else. He walked every section. He didn't carry a clipboard. He didn't have a checklist. He walked the way he'd walked it 100 times before, but slowly now with the specific attention of someone who is saying goodbye to a thing they love in the form of a building they built. The Northeast Quadrant first. The underground routing invisible now beneath finished floors. The monitoring stations humming quietly at the frequencies he'd specified. Zone 3. Redundancy. Ready for January. Ready for every January after that for the next 50 years. He stood in that section for a while. He put his hand on the wall, not dramatically, just the way you touch something you made to confirm it's real. It was real. The Workforce Training Wing. The rooms where 22 people had learned the language of this building's systems, where James Alderton had sat at a table and asked questions that told Caleb he was going to be fine, more than fine for the rest of his working life. Where Rita's daughter had stood on 3 consecutive Saturdays and looked at a thermal routing diagram with the expression of someone who had just recognized their future. The community interface, the public-facing section. he'd fought hardest for in the design framework, the part where the building met the neighborhood, the reading room, the consultation spaces, the systems display that would let any resident walk in and see in plain language how the facility was running and what it was doing for the community in real time. Transparency as architecture. That had been his phrase. Victoria had put it in the press materials. He stood in the main atrium and looked up. The building was full of morning light. He thought about the document in the inside pocket of a navy blazer on the night a woman had walked across a ballroom to find him. He thought about the weight of it. He thought about standing in a hotel parking garage for 6 minutes trying to decide whether to go inside. He thought about Emma saying his name in that particular way. He thought about Harold Whitmore and a railroad watch and a decision made in a university hallway in 2003 by a 22-year-old who had no idea what he was setting in motion. He stood in the light for a moment. Then his phone buzzed. It was Roy Hadley. The message read, "Cruise ready. Doors open in 4 hours. Building looks good, Whitmore." From Roy Hadley, that was an oration. Caleb texted back, "See you out front." He put his phone in his pocket and took one more look at the atrium. "All right," he said quietly to the building, to Harold, to the version of himself that had spent 20 years doing this work without anyone watching. "Let's go." The crowd that gathered outside the facility on March 15th was larger than anyone had officially projected, and exactly as large as Janelle had privately predicted 3 weeks earlier when she'd told Caleb. "The neighborhood wants to be here. Don't underestimate that." He hadn't underestimated it, but standing on the steps and looking out at the faces, the actual faces, not a projection or a planning document. He felt something shift behind his sternum, something that had no engineering language, something that was simply the experience of having built something real and seeing real people standing in front of it. Emma found him 20 minutes before the doors opened. She came through the crowd and up the steps and stood beside him in the specific way she'd always stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched just barely, which was Emma's version of holding his hand in public since she was 13. She looked out at the crowd. "Front row," she said. "You're here. I drove up at 5 this morning. I didn't want to be late." "Emma, it starts at 10. I wanted to see it before everyone else got here." She paused. "I went inside. Janelle let me in." He looked at her. "The northeast quadrant," she said quietly. "The Zone 3 routing. I found the section in the wall, the monitoring station you told me about on the phone. The one that took 14 days. She paused. "I put my hand on it." He didn't say anything. "It hums," she said. "Like it's alive. It's doing its job." "I know." She turned and looked at him. "You built something that hums, Dad. That's not nothing." He looked at his daughter, 18 years old, Ohio State engineering student, the person he had structured his entire life around, and who had structured something right back quietly without being asked the same way he did everything. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." She turned back to the crowd. "Is that Derek?" Caleb looked. It was Derek Osei, standing near the base of the steps, with his wife waving in the broad, unmistakable way that Derek waved at things. Caleb raised his hand. Derek pointed at the building and gave a thumbs up that contained approximately 40 years of friendship in the gesture. Janelle appeared at Caleb's other side. 10 minutes, she said. Victoria's car just pulled up. "The first cohort is ready. James has them lined up inside. They're ready." "Good. Media is positioned. City officials are in the second row as requested, not the first. The Neighborhood Residents Association is in the front." She paused. "First through the doors, per your instruction, are James Alderton and Rita Flores, and the full first cohort." Victoria agreed. "I know," she agreed. "I was on the call." "I know you were. I'm just confirming." A pause. "Caleb." "Yeah. Everything is right. Everything you designed is right." She said it the way Janelle said everything, precisely without decoration, which was exactly why it landed. He nodded. "Thank you, Janelle, for all of it." She straightened slightly, the way she received things with composure and dignity. "See you inside," she said, and went. Victoria Sterling arrived at 9:58, which was Victoria's way of arriving on time, exactly, with no margin for drama in either direction. She came up the steps and stood beside Caleb, and for a moment the two of them just looked out at the crowd together. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like someone who built a thing and is about to find out if it works." "It works. We know it works. Technically, I want to see it work in the hands of the people it's for." She looked at him. "That's the whole thing, isn't it?" she said. "That's always been the whole thing for you." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The crowd below them was settling into the anticipatory stillness of people who are about to be part of something. "I've been thinking about what to say," Victoria said. "In the remarks. I've written and rewritten it a dozen times. You don't need to write anything about me." "I know I don't need to. I want to." "Victoria, 23 years ago," she said, "a man I barely knew decided I was worth saving. He never asked me to know it. He never needed me to know it. He just decided it was true and acted accordingly." She paused. "I'm going to say that, in those words, and then I'm going to say your name." He looked at her. He thought about a 22-year-old standing in a university hallway looking through a door. He thought about a decision that took approximately 45 seconds, and that he had not in 23 years questioned or regretted for a single moment. "Okay," he said. "That's it. Okay. What do you want me to say?" "Something resistant. You're very good at resistant." "I've been working on it." The corner of her mouth moved. "Thank you," she said, "for the building, for the community framework, for the workforce program, for finding the error in Section 4 in the first 45 minutes. A pause. "For a pocket watch you sold in 2003. He turned and looked at her directly. "Thank you," he said, "for coming to find me." They stood together at the top of the steps. For one more moment, the billionaire and the consultant, the person who had been seen by the world, and the person who had spent 20 years being invisible, standing at the edge of something they had built together, in the specific way that things get built when two people understand what they're actually for. Then Janelle appeared in the doorway behind them. "It's time," she said. The ceremony was shorter than anyone expected and more affecting than anyone planned. Victoria spoke first. She said the things she'd said she would say. She said Caleb's name. She said it clearly in front of the cameras and the neighborhood and the city officials in the second row. She said it the way you say a name when you want it to be permanent. There was applause. Real applause, not the 3-second polite kind from a hotel ballroom 2 years ago, but the sustained kind that comes from people who feel the weight of the moment and want it to know they're there. Caleb spoke second. How was brief. He talked about the building as a system, about how every component existed to serve the components around it, and how a system was only as strong as its weakest maintained part, and how the greatest thing any engineer could do was build something that didn't need them anymore. He talked about the first cohort. He said their names. All 22 of them. Not as a list one at a time with something specific attached to each name. What they'd mastered. What they'd caught that he'd missed. What they brought to the building that he hadn't known to design for. When he said James Alderton's name, he said, "The man who understood Zone 3 redundancy better than anyone who drew the plans for it." James in the front row looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked up and nodded once. The kind of nod that means, "I'll carry that." Caleb held his gaze. Then he stepped back. Victoria returned to the podium. In a moment, the doors of the Harold Whitmore Innovation Center are going to open for the first time. Caleb went absolutely still. The crowd did too. Not because of what she'd said, because of the name. Because most people didn't know that name, and they could feel from the quality of the silence beside them that the man standing at the edge of the steps did. He had not known. He had not known the name. Victoria did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the crowd. Harold Whitmore was a machinist in Youngstown, Ohio. He spent his life building things that lasted. He raised a grandson who learned from him that the value of a thing is not in who sees it, but in whether it holds. She paused. The first people through those doors today will be the men and women who are going to make sure this building holds. For this community. For the next 50 years. She stepped back from the podium. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at the name on the building. The Harold Whitmore Innovation Center. His grandfather's name in stone on a building that would stand in Columbus, Ohio, serving a community running on systems designed by the quiet man. Nobody at the reunion had bothered to look at twice. He couldn't speak. Emma took his hand. Not briefly, she held it. The way she'd held it when she was small, and the world was large, and he was the thing between her and all of it. "It's right," she said quietly. "It's exactly right." He nodded. He couldn't say anything else. The doors opened. James Alderton went through first. The reception afterward moved around Caleb in the way that crowded events moved around a person when everyone wants a moment with them, and he had not yet learned how to be comfortable being wanted. He answered questions. He shook hands. He talked to a reporter from the Columbus paper who asked him what the project meant to him, and he said, "Ask the people who are going to run it." There the answer. The reporter, to her credit, wrote it down. Derek found him near the community interface section, standing in front of the real-time systems display, watching the facility's data populate across the screen in the clean, readable language Caleb had insisted on. "It's beautiful," Derek said. "It works. That's better than beautiful." "You know what I mean." Caleb looked at the display. He could read every number, every frequency, every system status indicator the way a musician reads a score, not as data, but as meaning. He knew what each number meant for the people who lived within a mile of this building. He knew what it meant in January. He knew what it meant in 15 years. "Yeah," he said. "I know what you mean." Derek stood beside him. Harold would have... I know. I'm going to say it anyway. Harold would have stood in this room and looked at his name on the wall and cried like a man who had raised his grandson right. Caleb pressed his lips together. He would have pretended he wasn't crying, he said. Of course he would have. He would have said something about the structural integrity of the display panel. Caleb almost laughed. Almost. "Yeah," he said. "He would have." Derek put his hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder. The 2-second kind. The kind that says everything it needs to say without requiring the words. Then Roy Hadley appeared on his other side. Hard hat, inexplicably still on, because Roy Hadley apparently attended formal ceremonies the same way he attended construction sites. Roy looked at the display. "Systems are running clean," he said. "I see that. Zone 3 redundancy is active. Thermal distribution is nominal." He paused. "Everything you designed is doing what you said it would do. That's the job." Roy was quiet for a moment. "In 37 years, he said, I've built 31 major structures." "I remember." "This is 32. He looked at the display. "I'm not going to need to see the others in 20 years to know they worked." Caleb looked at him. "This one I'll check on," Roy said. Simple as that. He walked away, hard hat and all, back into the crowd. The last person to find Caleb that afternoon was James Alderton. The reception was thinning. The city officials had moved on. The media had their footage. The neighborhood residents were still there. They'd been there the longest, which felt correct, because it was their building, and they'd apparently decided to stay in it for as long as anyone would let them. James found him near the entrance to the workforce training wing, standing alone for the first time all day. James looked different than he had at the certification ceremony in November. Not physically same man, same steady bearing. But something had settled in him. Something that happens when a person has been given real work to do and has done it and knows it. "I wanted to say something," James said. "Go ahead. When I came to the training program I was..." He paused, looking for the accurate word. "I was finished. Not in my head, but in my gut. 26 years at the plant, and then one morning the plant's just gone. And you're 56 years old, and the world has decided it doesn't need what you know how to do anymore." He paused. "I came to the program because my daughter told me to. I didn't believe it was going to be anything." Caleb waited. "The first time I walked the northeast quadrant with you, and you asked me what I thought was going to happen with Zone 3 in January, you asked me like my answer mattered, not like you were testing me, like you actually needed to know what I thought." James paused. I hadn't been asked what I thought about anything work-related in 4 years. The atrium was quieter now. Afternoon light had moved to the western windows. "You told me this building belongs to the people who run it," James said. "You said that to the whole room at the ceremony. But you said it to me first 6 months ago in the northeast quadrant, just the two of us." He looked at Caleb steadily. "I need you to know that that mattered. Specifically. To me. Before the ceremony and the name on the building and all of it that mattered." Caleb stood with that for a moment. He thought about a classroom. About looking through a door. About the weight of a decision made in 45 seconds that had taken 23 years to fully arrive. "You're going to take care of this building," he said. "Yes. And someday there's going to be someone who needs something, not the building, but something. And you're going to be in a position to give it to them." He looked at James directly. "When that happens, I trust you'll know what to do." James looked at him for a long moment. He extended his hand. Caleb shook it. Not the kind of hand that tries to establish something. The other kind. James walked back toward the training wing, his building, his systems, and Caleb watched him go. Emma appeared at his side. She didn't say anything. She just stood there shoulder to shoulder the way she always stood. They watched the last of the afternoon light move across the atrium floor. "Ready," she said. "Almost." He looked at the building one more time. He thought about a railroad watch made in Illinois in 1941. He thought about a grandfather's hands. He thought about a university hallway at night, and a girl holding a letter she'd already accepted as final. He thought about 23 years of invisible work in 5 cities, and the specific freedom of being a person who did what was right without needing anyone to know. He thought about his name on an engineering report finally. His grandfather's name on a wall forever. His daughter's hand in his at the moment the doors opened. He thought about what his grandfather had told him. What makes a man is what he does with it. He had done something with it. It was standing in front of him, humming quietly, running clean, ready for January. Ready for the next 50 years. Ready for James and Rita, and the 14-year-old who asked better questions than the engineers. Ready for a community that had been told in the language of architecture and systems and deliberate design that it was worth building something permanent for. "Ready," he said. He walked out of the Harold Whitmore Innovation Center with his daughter beside him, into the March afternoon, into whatever came next. Not the invisible man anymore, not the 2-line slide, not the person nobody thought to measure. Just a man who had spent his whole life doing the right thing without asking the world to notice. And who had finally completely irrevocably built something that would outlast the forgetting. That was always enough. It always